The ice crystals forming inside Lieutenant James Red Callahan's oxygen mask at 28,000 feet made a sound like faint static, a barely perceptible whisper that most men would have missed. But Callahan had been flying B-17s over occupied Europe for 7 months. He knew that sound. It was the sound of death creeping up on you, one frozen breath at a time. Below him, the gray-green patchwork of northern France stretched toward the German border, and somewhere in the distance, the industrial heart of the Reich waited with 10,000 anti-aircraft guns and 1,000 Luftwaffe fighters. But right now, in the pre-dawn darkness of this February morning in 1944, the enemy that concerned Red Callahan most was invisible, silent, and already killing men in the bomber formations around him. If you're finding value in stories like this one, stories of ordinary men facing impossible odds in frozen skies over Europe, take a moment to hit that subscribe button. These accounts deserve to be remembered, and your support keeps them alive. The mission briefing had started 3 hours earlier at 0400 hours in a Quonset hut at Thorpe Abbotts, home of the 100th Bombardment Group. The men called their unit the Bloody 100th because of its staggering losses, a nickname earned in blood over Regensburg and Schweinfurt, over Bremen and Münster. By February 1944, the average B-17 crew in the 8th Air Force faced a statistical reality that defied comprehension. Only 1 in 4 would complete their 25-mission tour. The rest would be killed, captured, or wounded so severely they would never fly again. That morning, Red Callahan's squadron was tasked with striking a ball-bearing factory near Frankfurt, a mission that would require 6 hours of flight time, most of it at altitudes where the temperature dropped to 50 degrees below zero and the air held only a fraction of the oxygen necessary to sustain human life. The briefing officer had unveiled the red yarn stretching across the map of Western Europe, and the collective groan from the assembled airmen told Red everything he needed to know. Frankfurt was deep, well defended, and the route would take them directly over some of the heaviest flak concentrations in the Reich. But what worried Red wasn't the flak or the fighters. It was what the meteorological officer said next. Atmospheric conditions at altitude would be unusually cold, with ice formation likely in oxygen systems. The words hung in the air like a death sentence for men who understood their implications. To understand what happened next requires understanding what it meant to fly and breathe at 30,000 feet in 1944. At that altitude, the atmospheric pressure drops to less than 1/3 of what it is at sea level. A human being breathing normal air at 30,000 feet has approximately 60 seconds of useful consciousness before hypoxia takes hold. After that, mental function deteriorates rapidly. Vision narrows, judgment fails, motor control becomes erratic. Within 3 to 4 minutes, unconsciousness claims you. Within 15 to 20 minutes, you are dead. The only thing standing between a B-17 crew member and this invisible killer was a rubber oxygen mask connected to the aircraft's central oxygen system, a system that in early 1944 was still plagued by design flaws that caused masks to freeze solid in extreme cold, cutting off the very air that kept men alive. Red Callahan's Flying Fortress, a battle-scarred B-17G named Heaven Can Wait, lifted off from Thorpe Abbotts at 6:30 hours, joining the stream of bombers climbing into the pre-dawn sky over East Anglia. The takeoff was harrowing, as it always was. Loaded beyond maximum weight with fuel and 10 500-pound bombs, the bomber struggled into the air, wheels leaving the concrete with barely feet to spare before the runway ended. The 4 Wright Cyclone engines roared at full power, pulling the 65,000-pound aircraft through the cold English air. Inside the aircraft, 10 men took their positions, Red at the pilot's seat, his co-pilot Lieutenant Frank Morrison beside him, Navigator Lieutenant Paul Kowalski in the nose compartment, Bombardier Lieutenant Sam Rizzo sharing that cramped space, Engineer and top turret gunner Sergeant Big Mike DeLuca behind the cockpit, Radio operator Sergeant Tommy Chen amidships, ball turret gunner Sergeant Billy Hawkins below, waist gunners Sergeants Pete Romano and Charlie Davis at their 50 caliber guns, and tail gunner Sergeant Jack Tennessee Taylor protecting the rear. Each man wore nearly 40 pounds of heated flight suits, flak vests, parachute harnesses, and oxygen equipment. Each man knew that every flight could be his last. The formation assembly took nearly 90 minutes, a dangerous aerial ballet involving hundreds of bombers climbing through clouds, seeking their assigned positions relative to brightly colored flares shot by squadron leaders. Mid-air collisions during formation were distressingly common, accounting for nearly 5% of all bomber losses during the war. But that morning, Heaven Can Wait found its slot without incident, tucking into the low squadron of the 349th Bomb Group, the position known grimly as Purple Heart Corner because of its vulnerability to enemy attack. As the massive formation crossed the English Channel and the coast of France appeared ahead, crew interphones crackled with the command that every man knew was coming: oxygen masks on. The moment his mask sealed against his face, Red Callahan began the ritual that every experienced B-17 pilot performed, checking his own breathing first, then calling out to each crew station to confirm oxygen flow. This was not paranoia. It was survival. The Army Air Forces had learned through bitter experience that the silent onset of hypoxia made it nearly impossible for a man to recognize his own symptoms. A crewman suffering oxygen deprivation might feel perfectly fine even as his brain slowly shut down. The only defense was constant vigilance and crew communication. One by one his crew members reported back oxygen flowing, blinker indicators showing proper function, mask seals tight. Everything nominal, everything fine. At 15,000 feet, the temperature inside the unpressurized, unheated fuselage dropped to 20 below zero. By 20,000 feet, it was 40 below. The wind howled through the waist gun positions where Pete Romano and Charlie Davis stood, exposed to the slipstream through openings designed to allow them to swing their guns against attacking fighters. Both men wore every layer of clothing available, electrically heated suits that often malfunctioned, fleece-lined boots, silk gloves under leather gloves under heated gloves. Still, frostbite casualties in the 8th Air Force numbered in the thousands. Still, men lost fingers and toes and ears to the merciless cold. 25,000 feet. The formation approached the German border, and Red could see the first black puffs of anti-aircraft fire appearing in the distance. His navigator, Paul Kowalski, was calling out checkpoints over the interphone, confirming their course, watching the landscape below through breaks in the cloud cover. The bombardier, Sam Rizzo, was reviewing target photos, preparing to take control of the aircraft for the final bomb run. In the ball turret beneath the belly of the bomber, Billy Hawkins rotated his cramped sphere of plexiglass and steel, scanning the sky below for enemy fighters. Everything was proceeding according to plan. And then, at 27,000 feet, Tennessee Taylor's voice came over the interphone with a single word that made Red's blood run colder than the air around him: trouble. The tail gunner's voice was slurred, thick, wrong. Red recognized the symptoms instantly, the speech pattern of a man whose brain was being starved of oxygen. Tennessee, check your mask, check your connection. His own voice was sharp, commanding, the practiced tone of a man who had seen too many friends die. There was a pause. Then Tennessee's voice again, even more confused. Mask is... I can't feel my hands. And then silence. Complete, terrifying silence. Red didn't hesitate. Big Mike, get back there, now. Technical Sergeant Mike DeLuca was already moving before the words finished, grabbing a portable walk-around oxygen bottle from its rack and heading toward the catwalk that ran through the bomb bay. The walk-around bottles held about 8 minutes of oxygen, enough for a crewman to move through the aircraft on emergency business. DeLuca clipped one to his harness, ducked through the narrow passage between the hanging bombs, and made his way aft. What DeLuca found in the tail section confirmed Red's fears. Tennessee Taylor was slumped over his twin .50 caliber guns, unconscious, his skin turning the grayish-blue color of advanced hypoxia. His oxygen mask had iced over completely, the moisture from his breath freezing solid in the extreme cold and blocking the flow of oxygen through the demand regulator. The standard procedure in such situations was to pound the mask against something hard to break the ice free, but DeLuca could see that the ice had formed, not just in the mask, but in the connecting hose, a solid plug of frozen condensation that no amount of pounding would dislodge. "Skipper, Tennessee's out. Mask is frozen solid. Hose too. Need a replacement." DeLuca's voice was steady despite the crisis. He was holding his own walk-around bottle mask to Tennessee's face, trying to revive him. At 30,000 feet, where they were now climbing, a man could suffer irreversible brain damage after just a few minutes without oxygen. Every second counted. Red's mind raced through the options. The B-17 carried spare masks, but they were stored in the radio compartment amidships. DeLuca was already depleting his walk-around bottle, keeping Tennessee alive. There wasn't time for him to traverse back through the bomb bay, retrieve a spare mask, and return before his own oxygen ran out. And then, as Red processed the scope of the emergency, waist gunner Charlie Davis reported in, "Skipper, my mask is icing up too. I'm losing flow." It wasn't just Tennessee, it was happening across the aircraft. The atmospheric conditions were exactly what the meteorological officer had warned about, ice forming in oxygen systems throughout the formation. Red could see it now, other bombers in the formation beginning to wobble, to drift out of position, signs that their crews were also falling victim to the invisible killer. One B-17, 300 yards to their right, suddenly nosed over and dropped out of the formation entirely, plummeting toward the earth below with sickening speed. Red knew what that meant. The pilots were unconscious, the crew dying, the aircraft doomed, and he knew that unless he did something, his own crew and his own aircraft would follow within minutes. The standard solution to widespread oxygen system failure was to descend to lower altitude, where supplemental oxygen wasn't required. But descending meant leaving the protection of the formation, and the skies over Germany were swarming with Luftwaffe fighters, specifically targeting isolated bombers. A lone B-17 at 15,000 feet was a death sentence of a different kind. Red had seen too many friends shot out of the sky after leaving formation to consider that option lightly. And there was another problem. They were 3 minutes from the initial point, 3 minutes from beginning their bomb run on the target. Aborting now meant the mission would be a failure, but pressing on meant his crew might die before they ever reached the target. Red Callahan made his decision in the space of a heartbeat. He keyed his interphone. "All crew, listen up. We're going to circulate our walk-around bottles. Frank, take the controls." His co-pilot, Frank Morrison, gripped the yoke as Red unstrapped from his seat. The pilot's position had its own dedicated oxygen supply, less prone to icing because of its proximity to the cockpit heating. Red could afford to sacrifice his walk-around bottle without immediately endangering himself. He grabbed the spare bottle from the cockpit rack and moved toward the radio compartment. What Red Callahan did in the next 6 minutes would become legend among the survivors of the 100th Bomb Group, though you won't find his name in the official histories. The Army Air Forces didn't award medals for improvisation. They barely acknowledged the epidemic of oxygen system failures that killed thousands of airmen during the strategic bombing campaign. But the men who were there remembered. They remembered watching their young pilot move through the aircraft with methodical precision, swapping out iced masks, redistributing functional walk-around bottles, and performing a field modification that no training manual had ever described. The modification was born of desperation and mechanical intuition. Red had noticed something during his months of flying. The ball turret position, occupied by Billy Hawkins, had a redundant oxygen connection that fed separately from the main system. The ball turret's location at the bottom of the aircraft, exposed to the slipstream, meant its oxygen line experienced different temperature dynamics than the rest of the plane. While the interior lines were freezing, the ball turret connection remained relatively clear. Red realized that if he could jury-rig the ball turret's supply to serve multiple crew stations, he might be able to keep enough men conscious to continue the mission. He explained his plan to Big Mike DeLuca, who had managed to revive Tennessee Taylor with the walk-around bottle and was now crouching over the unconscious waist gunner, Charlie Davis. The engineer understood immediately. Working with numb fingers in 50 below zero air, DeLuca disconnected a section of spare oxygen hose from the emergency kit and ran it from the ball turret's junction box through the waist compartment. Red, meanwhile, had Tommy Chen in the radio compartment working on another improvised connection. Billy Hawkins, still in the ball turret, volunteered to reduce his own oxygen intake to a minimum, relying on the portable bottle, while his main supply was diverted. It was a ridiculous plan, a desperate plan, an against regulations in 6 different ways plan. And it worked. Within 4 minutes, Red had created a secondary oxygen distribution network that was feeding clear, unfrozen air to 6 of his 10 crew members. The remaining 4, including himself and Frank Morrison in the cockpit, were able to cycle through the limited walk-around bottles, while the others breathed through the improvised system. It wasn't elegant. Billy Hawkins later described his experience in the ball turret as trying to sip through a pinched straw while doing somersaults, taking shallow breaths from his portable bottle between rotations of his turret to scan for fighters. But it kept them alive. It kept them in formation, and it kept them on course for the target. At 10:47 hours, Heaven Can Wait reached the initial point. Sam Rizzo's voice came over the interphone, steady despite everything. Bombardier to pilot, I have the target. Taking control. The Norden bomb sight linked to the aircraft's autopilot, and for the next 4 minutes, the bomber flew straight and level through a sky filled with exploding flak. The black puffs erupted all around them, rocking the aircraft with concussive force, peppering the fuselage with white-hot shrapnel. Red was back in the pilot's seat now, hands off the controls, trusting his bombardier, trusting the autopilot, trusting his patched-together oxygen system to keep his crew breathing long enough to deliver their payload. Bombs away. The aircraft lurched upward as 10,000 pounds of high explosives dropped from the bay. Below, the ball-bearing factory that supplied half the Reich's armaments production erupted in flame and smoke. Red immediately took back control, banking the bomber toward the rally point where the formation would regroup for the long flight home. And in that moment, looking out over the flak-scarred sky, he saw something that made his heart clench in his chest. 3 other B-17s from his squadron were falling out of formation. The oxygen crisis that had nearly claimed his own crew had struck the entire group. Red could see bombers drifting, losing altitude, their crews unconscious or dying at their stations. One aircraft rolled completely inverted before plunging toward the earth. Another spiraled down trailing smoke that might have been engine damage or might have been the condensation of desperate men trying to descend to breathable air. A third simply went into a gentle dive from which it never recovered, as if its pilots had fallen asleep at the controls. Red knew that he should have stayed in formation, should have maintained position, should have followed standard procedure, and hoped the ground crews could sort out the oxygen situation when they landed. But Red Callahan had never been particularly good at following standard procedure, and he had just spent the most terrifying minutes of his life figuring out how to keep his own crew alive. He wasn't about to watch his squadron mates die without trying the same thing. "Frank, you have the aircraft. Stay in formation. I'm going on radio." What happened next violated approximately every communications protocol in the 8th Air Force Manual. Breaking radio silence during a mission could reveal the formation's position to German fighters, could interfere with command communications, could create chaos in the carefully choreographed dance of hundreds of aircraft trying to survive hostile skies. But Red Callahan keyed his transmitter and broadcast on the guard frequency that every aircraft in the formation was monitoring. All units, this is Heaven Can Wait. Your oxygen systems are icing. Repeat, widespread oxygen system ice. Use your ball turret connections. They're running clear. Cross-connect to ball turret junction. I say again, cross-connect to ball turret junction for clear oxygen. The transmission lasted maybe 15 seconds. In the radio compartment, Tommy Chen was staring at his pilot with an expression that mixed horror at the protocol violation with desperate hope that someone was listening. And someone was. Within a minute, Red's radio crackled with a response from the squadron leader's aircraft. Heaven Can Wait? Confirm ball turret connection clear? Red confirmed. 30 seconds later, the squadron leader was relaying the information to the group and the group to the wing, and suddenly Red Callahan's desperate improvisation was spreading through the 8th Air Force like wildfire. Not every aircraft could implement the fix. Not every crew had the technical knowledge or the functional walk-around bottles to keep their men conscious long enough to perform the modification. At least 6 B-17s from the 100th Bomb Group went down that day, victims of the oxygen crisis and the German defenses, both. But for every aircraft that implemented Red's cross-connection technique, an average of 2 crew members who would otherwise have succumbed to hypoxia remained conscious and functional. Across the formation, that meant dozens of lives saved, dozens of bombers that made it back to England instead of becoming flaming wreckage scattered across the German countryside. Heaven Can Wait landed at Thorpe Abbotts at 14:23 hours, 6 hours, and 53 minutes after takeoff. The ground crews counted 147 shrapnel holes in the fuselage, a damaged tail assembly, and 2 engines that were barely functional. But all 10 crew members were alive. Tennessee Taylor had a splitting headache and no memory of the period when he was unconscious, but the medics pronounced him fit for duty after observation. Charlie Davis had frostbite on 3 fingers, but would keep them all. The rest of the crew emerged shaken but whole, gathering on the tarmac for the traditional post-mission whiskey before debriefing. The debriefing itself lasted 3 hours, as intelligence officers grilled Red about his radio transmission and the improvised oxygen technique. Some of the brass were furious about the protocol violation. Others were keenly interested in the technical details of his cross-connection. An engineering officer from the 8th Air Force Service Command showed up to take notes, asking detailed questions about hose diameters, connection points, and the specific configuration Red had used. By the time Red finally made it to his bunk, he had explained his improvised fix to so many officers that he could recite it in his sleep. And then something remarkable happened. Within 72 hours, the 8th Air Force issued an emergency technical bulletin describing the ball turret cross-connection technique as an approved field modification for use during oxygen system ice emergencies. Within 2 weeks, engineering teams were developing permanent fixes based on Red's improvised solution, including heated oxygen lines and improved demand regulators that were less prone to freezing. Within 3 months, the techniques pioneered under fire by Red Callahan and others like him had been incorporated into the standard B-17 oxygen system, contributing to what official reports would later describe as an 80% reduction in anoxia accidents and a 68% reduction in anoxia fatalities between late 1943 and late 1944. The men who benefited from these improvements never knew the names of the pilots and crew members who had figured out the solutions under fire. The official histories attributed the improvements to engineering teams at the Central Medical Establishment at High Wycombe and the Army Air Force's Technical Service Command. And in a sense, that was true. Those organizations formalized the innovations, tested them, and implemented them across the force. But the original insights came from men like Red Callahan, men who faced impossible situations at 30,000 feet and refused to accept that the only options were death or failure. Red Callahan flew 23 more missions after the Frankfurt raid. He never talked much about what happened that day, and when pressed, he deflected credit to his crew, especially Big Mike DeLuca, whose mechanical skill had made the cross-connection possible. "I just had an idea," Red would say. "Mike made it work. The guys kept flying while we figured it out. That's the whole story." It wasn't the whole story, of course. The whole story included the terror of watching his friends falling from the sky, the desperate improvisation in 50 below zero air, the decision to break radio silence and risk court-martial to save lives beyond his own aircraft. But Red Callahan wasn't the kind of man who told those stories. He was the kind of man who lived them, and then went on to live more. He completed his 25th mission on April 28, 1944, earning the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Lucky Bastard certificate that came with surviving a full tour in the 8th Air Force. He could have gone home then. Instead, he volunteered for 10 additional missions, flying as a formation leader and passing on his hard-won knowledge to newer crews. Among the lessons he taught, how to recognize the early signs of oxygen system ice, how to maintain constant communication with crew members to catch hypoxia early, and how to implement field modifications when the equipment failed. He estimated that he trained approximately 60 pilots during those additional missions. If each of those pilots saved even one crewman using Red's techniques, the ripple effect of his knowledge extended to hundreds of lives. The war ended for Red Callahan on August 17, 1944, when flak over a synthetic oil plant in Merseburg finally caught up with Heaven Can Wait. The aircraft took a direct hit to the bomb bay, igniting the fuel tanks and giving the crew less than 30 seconds to bail out. 7 of the 10 men escaped, including Red, who suffered third-degree burns on his hands and face during the evacuation. He spent the remainder of the war in Stalag Luft III, the prisoner of war camp, later famous for the Great Escape. His burn injuries, ironically, probably saved his life. The German guards assigned him to light duty in the camp infirmary, rather than the work details where prisoners faced exposure and exhaustion. Red Callahan came home in May 1945, weighing 40 pounds less than when he had left for England 2 years earlier. He married his high school sweetheart in June, started a family in July, and never flew an airplane again. When asked why, he said simply, "I used up all my luck up there, time to keep my feet on the ground." He took a job with his father-in-law's hardware store in Dayton, Ohio, eventually buying the business and running it until his retirement in 1982. He attended squadron reunions when he could, shaking hands with men he had trained, embracing families of men who had not made it home. He rarely spoke of the Frankfurt mission or the oxygen fix that bore his name among the survivors of the 100th Bomb Group. "That was just one day," he would say. "We had a lot of days up there." The technical innovations that Red Callahan helped pioneer remained in service for the remainder of the war and influenced aircraft oxygen system design for decades afterward. The principle of redundant oxygen supply routes, inspired by his ball turret cross-connection, became standard in military aircraft design. The emphasis on field-modifiable systems that could be adapted by crews under combat conditions informed the development of everything from the B-29 Superfortress to the early jet bombers of the Korean War. Engineers who had studied Red's improvised solution went on to design systems that saved countless lives in conflicts that Red Callahan never saw and probably never thought about. There is a certain kind of heroism that never makes the history books. It is the heroism of mechanics and engineers and pilots who solve problems under impossible conditions, who improvise solutions that no training manual ever described, who refuse to accept that the only options are death or failure. The 8th Air Force lost more than 26,000 men killed in action during World War II and thousands more who were wounded or captured. The survival rate for bomber crews in 1943 was so low that actuaries could have calculated a man's life expectancy in missions, not years. And yet, by 1944, that survival rate had improved dramatically, not because the Germans had suddenly become less effective at defending their homeland, but because men like Red Callahan kept finding ways to survive. The oxygen crisis of February 1944 killed dozens of airmen across the 8th Air Force that day. It would have killed hundreds more, if not for the quick thinking of crew members who improvised solutions in the moments before hypoxia claimed their consciousness. Red Callahan's radio transmission and field modification were replicated independently by at least 3 other pilots that same day, men who figured out the same solution through the same combination of desperation and mechanical intuition. None of them knew about the others until after the war. All of them survived, and all of them contributed to the collective knowledge that eventually made high-altitude bombing survivable for the men who followed them. James Red Callahan passed away on February 14, 2003, 59 years to the day after the Frankfurt mission. He was 82 years old, surrounded by his wife of 58 years, 4 children, 11 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren. His obituary in the Dayton Daily News mentioned his hardware store, his community service, his church involvement. It did not mention the Frankfurt mission or the oxygen fix or the lives he had saved at 30,000 feet over Nazi Germany. Red would have wanted it that way. He had never been the kind of man who told those stories. But the men who were there remembered. At the 100th Bomb Group reunion in 2002, the last one Red Callahan attended, a retired colonel named William Hadley stood up during the dinner and asked for the room's attention. Hadley had been a second lieutenant navigator on another B-17 in the formation that day, and he had been drifting in and out of consciousness when Red's radio transmission came through. His ball turret gunner, following the instructions, had cross-connected the oxygen supply and kept the crew alive long enough to implement a proper fix. "I've been looking for the man who made that broadcast for 58 years, Hadley said, his voice breaking. "Red, I never got a chance to thank you. You saved my life." Red Callahan, bent with age and shy as ever about taking credit, stood slowly from his chair. He looked at the colonel, at the room full of old men who had once been young pilots and gunners and navigators, at the faces of those who had survived and the photographs of those who had not. And then he said the only thing that seemed adequate to the moment. "We all saved each other up there. That's the only way any of us made it home." The story of Red Callahan's manual oxygen fix illustrates a truth about warfare that the official histories often overlook, that battles are won not just by generals and admirals and politicians, but by individual soldiers and sailors and airmen who make split-second decisions under impossible conditions. The men who flew B-17s over Nazi Germany faced odds that would have been unacceptable in any peacetime profession. They climbed into aluminum tubes filled with high explosives, flew for hours through skies swarming with enemy fighters and anti-aircraft artillery, and breathed through rubber masks that could freeze solid and kill them without warning. And yet they kept flying, kept fighting, kept improvising solutions to problems that no one had anticipated. They did it because they believed in the cause they were fighting for. They did it because they trusted the men flying beside them. And they did it because when you are 22 years old and 30,000 feet over Nazi Germany, the only alternative to finding a way to survive is dying. The oxygen systems on B-17s were eventually fixed through a combination of improved engineering and better training. The heated oxygen lines and demand regulators that became standard by late 1944 owed their existence to the field modifications pioneered by men like Red Callahan, though official credit went to the engineering teams who formalized and implemented the solutions. The training programs at the Central Medical Establishment at High Wycombe, which taught airmen to recognize the symptoms of hypoxia and implement emergency procedures incorporated lessons learned from missions like the Frankfurt Raid. By the time the war ended, the anoxia fatality rate in the 8th Air Force had dropped by more than two-thirds from its peak in 1943. Thousands of airmen who would have died in earlier years survived because of improvements that came too late for the men who pioneered them. This pattern repeated itself throughout the air war over Europe. Innovations in body armor developed at High Wycombe, based on data from combat casualties, reduced flak injuries by 75%. Improved ditching procedures worked out through trial and error by crews who went down in the English Channel saved hundreds of lives that would have been lost to drowning or hypothermia. Better formation tactics, refined through bloody experience over Schweinfurt and Regensburg, reduced the vulnerability of bombers to fighter attack. In every case, the men who paid the highest price for these innovations were the first to implement them, the ones who figured out what worked through the process of barely surviving what didn't. Red Callahan never received a medal for the Frankfurt mission. The protocol violation of his radio transmission was noted in his file, though no disciplinary action was taken. The lives he saved were not counted, because the Army Air Forces had no mechanism for counting lives saved by improvised field modifications. He returned home to a country that celebrated the pilots who shot down enemy fighters and the generals who planned the campaigns, and he quietly went about the business of building a life in peacetime. He raised children who grew up knowing that their father had been a pilot in the war, but not knowing the details of what that had meant. He attended reunions with men who had shared experiences that no civilian could understand, and he rarely spoke of those experiences to anyone else. But the ripple effects of what Red Callahan did that day extended far beyond his own life. The 60 pilots he trained during his extended tour went on to train others, and those others trained more, passing down knowledge that had been purchased in blood and terror over the skies of Germany. The engineering improvements inspired by his improvised fix saved lives in Korea and Vietnam, and every conflict since. The principle of crew resource management, of empowering individual crew members to identify problems and implement solutions, became a foundation of military aviation safety. None of this traced directly back to a lieutenant named Red Callahan, who broke radio silence over Frankfurt in February 1944. But all of it flowed from the same source, men who refused to accept that their only options were death or failure, and who found a third way through sheer determination and ingenuity. At 30,000 feet, the air is thin and cold and utterly unforgiving. The human body was not designed to function at that altitude, and the only thing that makes survival possible is technology, oxygen systems, and heated suits and pressurized cabins. When that technology fails, as it did over Frankfurt on that February day in 1944, men die. But sometimes in the space between technology failing and men dying, there is room for human ingenuity to create solutions that no engineer anticipated. Red Callahan found that space. He filled it with a field modification made of spare hoses and desperate innovation. And because he did, men lived who would otherwise have died, and the knowledge of how to survive spread through the 8th Air Force like a lifeline thrown across the frozen sky. The story ends where it began, with a pilot named Red Callahan listening to the sound of ice forming in his oxygen mask at 28,000 feet, recognizing the whisper of death creeping up on him and refusing to let it win. That moment of recognition and the actions that followed separated the living from the dead that day over Germany. It was not courage in the conventional sense, not the courage of charging a machine gun nest or storming a beach. It was the quieter courage of competence under pressure, of keeping your head while the world fell apart around you, of solving problems that had no solutions because the alternative was unthinkable. That kind of courage doesn't make for dramatic movies or stirring speeches, but It is the kind of courage that wins wars, one frozen breath at a time.